On the 12 days of Jaysmas, I reviewed all our collected war. Demonic hair. Ari 4x2.
Bingo.
Hallucinating people. Happening. Paper buggy-o. Murder frame detective.
A cult.
Ari 4 in space.
Isaac.
Ditch digging man. 3 Stella boys, 1 punch-out tugging epilogue of pain, and a purple dude that's been homebrewed.
Psycho Waluigi. Poor Waluigi. Nintendo created you and then basically disowned you, showing no interest in expanding your character whatsoever or even allowing you to show up in a single mainline Mario, Luigi, or even a Wario title. But one lone developer with a heart of gold decided to change all of that, with a fan game called Psycho Waluigi. Finally, our lanky man in purple gets his own adventure, complete with his own unique game mechanic as well, telekinesis. That's right, Mario may have his athletic prowess, Luigi his ghost-busting skills, and Wario his utilization of being tortured, but Waluigi can grab objects, weapons, and even treasure with the sheer power of his mind. The thing that makes the telekinesis so cool is that with every enemy you grab, you'll be able to use their own abilities for a bit until their usefulness meter goes dry. Leaf boomerangs, ice blasts, lightning strikes, all of these are only a grab away. An even cooler aspect of the game are its levels, each a different kingdom that Waluigi must overthrow. The developer really went all out with the themes here. Instead of relying on basic ideas like a forest level, a water level, etc., we're given some really creative lands to explore here. Soap Sud Kingdom, a land filled with cleansing foam and bubble ghosts. Crumbling Kingdom, a decrepit place that's literally falling apart as you make your way through it, and a Home Hardware Kingdom, which isn't actually a kingdom at all. It's just a hardware store with kingdom in its name. Yep, you won't find these beauties in a Mario game. And this is just a tiny sampling of what the game has to offer. What makes these levels even cooler is that many of them contain special environmental mechanics that only serve to bring more diversity to the already interesting gameplay. In the Fluff and Stuff Kingdom, you can pull random objects and enemies from any of the cloud-filled areas. The Soap Sud Kingdom has entire rooms made of solid soap, which we can chunk away to clear a path. Terror Toy Kingdom is a nightmarish world where things go completely dark whenever you're not holding onto an enemy. Oh, and don't forget about Raging Star Kingdom, which has these Alolan starmen that want Waluigi dead. But if you manage to snatch them, you'll be able to force them to give you invincibility to help you plow through the level's obstacles. I absolutely love the eclectic range of ideas that this game implements. It really makes you look forward to what each new level is going to surprise you with next. Every world has a fun boss fight, which gets increasingly less straightforward with how they're beaten. The music seems to be taken from many different sources, mostly remixes of tracks from other Nintendo games, from Mario Kart, Wario World, to even Zelda. I can't really think of much to complain about with this game, especially since it's available for free online. I suppose the controls aren't quite as polished as you might expect in an official Mario title, but it still feels better than probably a lot of the fan-made games out there. I was also told that you can run out of time during boss fights, which will force you to redo the entire level leading up to them, which sounds a little annoying if I'm being honest. Luckily, I somehow managed to avoid this altogether. Thunder Dragon, if that is your real name, you did the Purple Wah Man some great justice here. If I was Nintendo, I'd probably hire you in a heartbeat. Can't wait to see more of your stuff. Celeste. This is one of those games that I feel has probably been praised many times already, and it's likely going to be difficult for me to really add anything new, but gosh darn it did I enjoy this game, so I feel like I have to say something. Where do I begin? Both the visuals and music in the game are really great. It's got this excellent pixel art style that has this perfect mix of chibi yet detailed. It legit looks like the pixels have physics at times, which is so nice, and heck, maybe it does. Some of my favorite types of games are the ones that are simple to pick up, yet the game just keeps dialing up the difficulty and introducing new challenges as you progress through it, forcing you to master that simple gameplay if you want to pass those levels. Celeste fits into this mold pretty well, requiring you to be so precise that success is only really possible because the controls are so tight. The story matches very well with how difficult the game is, as the concept of having to climb a mountain is an easily understood symbol for overcoming a great hardship or challenge. And sure enough, this is a game that will test your limits. But in the end, it'll feel satisfying to complete. Well, I could say that about the base game at least. Now the epilogue level, that's a whole different story. I'm talking about Chapter 9 in particular. God, Chapter 9. Just saying it again is making me shiver. What's so bad about Chapter 9, you ask? Well, while the rest of the game is challenging enough in its own right, Chapter 9 takes things to a whole different planet, and it gave me more trouble than every single other chapter in the game combined. Why is that? It's because you literally have to learn speedrunning mechanics in order to even begin approaching the rooms here. Special, specific, split-second tight speedrunning moves that you've never had to use before. Now you gotta learn them, and you gotta utilize them perfectly in the hardest rooms the game has to offer if you want to get through. This was enough to push the game from a really fun and rewarding challenge to suddenly one of the most torturous gaming experiences I've ever dealt with. Whereas before I kept going on because the goal of climbing the mountain was enough to push me onward, here I was only driven by spite. Only by the fact that I refused to let the game beat me. I was told later that some of the optional levels in the game, called the B and C sides, actually teach you these speedrunning moves at a more reasonable pace, and maybe if I had done those first, I would have had more practice and been better prepared for Chapter 9. But as it is, I did not have that prerequisite, and I suffered greatly for it. It's one thing to die a lot in a game because it's just hard. It's another thing altogether when you're dying constantly because you don't even have a grasp on the basic thing you need to know how to do in order to even attempt to progress. You could probably see why I found that pretty frustrating. The worst part of all is the very last room of the game, which is this enormous obstacle course of hazards that you're required to navigate through using all these advanced techniques and without making a single fatal flaw. Ooh, gosh, I think I can feel my blood pressure rising just thinking about this, so I better wrap this up. Overall, Celeste, the base game, is something that I'd happily recommend to any experienced 2D platforming players that are really into a tough challenge. That final epilogue chapter though? Oh, don't do it. Don't do it. Do not do it. It isn't worth it. Please, trust me. If only I could turn back time and warn myself, I would go back and I'd Let's move on to the next game. Pato Box. Punch-Out for NES is one of my absolute favorite games of all time. I think I could easily count it in my top 5. So an indie game taking on the Punch-Out formula? Hell yeah, let's see it. How do I explain Punch-Out? Basically, it's a boss rush game that relies heavily on quick reflexes, features an array of goofy international stereotypes, and is easily one of the tightest playing games in the entire NES library. It has to be, or else beating Mike Tyson would be impossible. Heck, just playing him on a non-CRT TV is already putting you at a disadvantage. But anyway, let's get back to the featured game here. Pato Box takes that gameplay of Punch-Out, but builds a story around it that actually includes you exploring this enormous hotel as you make your way from fight to fight. The visuals are done in this black and white noir style, which looks pretty cool. Never mind the fact we're playing as a duck with the body of a human boxer, or is it a boxer with a duck's head? The exploration bits take up a large part of the game, not only because we're talking to people and reading texts which flesh out the narrative, but also because getting to fight our opponents isn't as easy as just walking up to them. Each floor of the hotel hosts different types of obstacles that we must deal with before we can have our match, whether that be avoiding security detection, surviving a series of hazardous conveyor belts, or even winning it big in a casino. The bosses themselves are quite a rogues gallery, each using an arsenal of unique moves that definitely shouldn't be boxing legal during their matches with you. Sometimes you have to face off against robots that your combatant has summoned. Other times, you're tasked with a dodging endurance round as a machine blasts you with projectiles from all sides. In one instance, you're fighting a chef as he's in the middle of cooking a giant pot of stew. Make sure you catch the right ingredients while also dodging those soupy attacks. I honestly think that all of this is great, punch-out style gameplay against an eclectic group of bosses who are anything but boxers most of the time, and an adventuring puzzle action thing going on in between the fights to boot. I do have to say though that unfortunately I didn't love this game. Really, it mostly just boils down to two things. For one, I had an extremely hard time reading the opponent's moves to learn the strategies for fighting them. I'm not sure what it is exactly. It may be the lack of color making unimportant background objects and significant tells blend together for me, or it may just be my inability to catch a lot of the subtle differences in the animations, but I struggled a lot with this game visually. The other thing, and probably most important, is that the controls just didn't feel as tight as they probably should have been. As I stated earlier, the only reason Punch-Out works is because the gameplay is so tight. While not broken by any means, the controls just didn't quite meet that level of polish, or at least that's how it felt for me. And with loose controls, it means that first problem of mine is exacerbated further. There were a lot of elements to this game that I loved, but I had a lot of frustration with it too. I don't mean to sound harsh, but it's because of the fact that it could have probably been up there as one of my favorite games of the entire year that it makes me feel more compelled to explain the problems I had with it. I'm well aware that video games are not easy to make, and the fact that this indie team was even able to come out with something this cool is amazing unto itself. I would love if these guys took a crack at this same concept, tightening those controls up more, and maybe consider adding some color this time to help people like me who had trouble catching those visual clues. Spookware. I'm a real big WarioWare fan. There's just something about the extremely simple yet eclectic collection of micro games, the lovable characters, and the bizarre humor of the games that just hits all the right sweet spots for me. I even picked up a physical copy of the newest one that just came out a couple months ago, and what do you know, it's pretty good. But today we're not talking about that. We're talking about Spookware. What is a Spookware, you may ask? Well, it's an indie game that wears its biggest influence on the cover, or in this case, in the title. As you might expect, Spookware is much like WarioWare in that it contains a bunch of hectic micro games that you have to beat to progress, except they instead tend to focus on a comedy horror aspect. This already sounds like a neat little idea on its own, as surprisingly it's hard to find an indie game out there that's tried to tackle the WarioWare style. But Spookware goes another step beyond by actually spending the majority of the game's length on an RPG-like narrative. Really? Yeah, the game actually has a proper story which centers around three Skelebros named Lefty, Mitty, and Righty. Each chapter of the game takes you on one of their connecting misadventures, such as their attempts to attend high school, solve a murder mystery on a cruise, and run a successful restaurant in the big city. The game does a good job giving us amusing dialogue between the three bros, as well as entertaining us with a number of wacky NPCs that we meet along the way. Interestingly, while each chapter does include a sequence of microgames done in a row a la WarioWare, usually at the end, a lot of the time you actually find yourself doing isolated microgames in the middle of the exploration narrative parts of the game, such as playing the bongos to convince other students to join your band, or sketching an outline of a body with chalk. This new way of utilizing microgames is pretty cool and lets you scratch that gaming itch in between the chunks of the story. As for the wandering story bits, the way it plays out reminds me a lot of Paper Mario, even visually with the flat paper cut style characters in a 3D environment. I wouldn't say that the writing and dialogue quite hits that superb style of Paper Mario, or even something like Undertale, but those are some pretty high bars to reach, and overall it was very enjoyable. It admittedly felt like the microgames weren't always quite as intuitive as the ones in WarioWare, especially with what's supposed to be the quick text hints. Pick a sarcophagus. Wait, I clicked on it. I was supposed to drag the body, I'm guessing. They didn't say put in sarcophagus, they said pick a sarcophagus. But never to the degree that it made things frustrating. I also think that while the characters all being skeletons is a cool concept, it does unfortunately mean that there isn't quite as much variety with the various characters as something like the aforementioned Paper Mario or Undertale, since those games have a bunch of different species running around. They do a pretty good job giving the characters distinct personalities to make up for that though. If there's one more thing to suggest, I'd say that the hell yeah victory tone is sweet at first, but it's unfortunately the only one you'll hear over and over as you play through the game. Hell yeah. If they threw in some more sound clips to alternate between for this, then I think we'd be golden. I like how each of the chapters gives one of the three Skelebros a spotlight to shine in, and features microgames with differing control schemes. For instance, while most of the games are played via the arrow keys, all the Chapter 2 microgames utilize the mouse only instead. And Chapter 3 introduces a Diner Dash style gameplay in between the long stretch of cooking-based microgames. As of now, there's one episode of the game containing 3 chapters, with 3 more episodes of 3 chapters each coming in the future. It took me about 4.5 hours to beat the game casually running through it, but I didn't 100% it or unlock all the microgames, meaning that there is still more to do. Overall, this game was a lot of fun, and it makes me hope that the WarioWare team sees it and gains some inspiration of their own. Could you imagine playing as Wario, running around Diamond City, interacting with fun characters like Orbulon, Dr. Krygor, or Ashley, in a Wario adventure game with a proper fleshed out story? Oh, okay, we may be asking for a bit much there, knowing Nintendo, but as for now, we do have Spookware to fill that fantasy. Shovel Knight. Of all the games I played this year, I think Shovel Knight is the one that appealed the most to my primal gaming sensibilities. Super Nintendo was my first console as a really young child, and challenging 2D platformers may be the genre that I hold nearest and dearest to my heart, so with that in mind, I think it's pretty obvious that I had a fantastic time with Shovel Knight. I could tell you all the obvious things that make this such a superb title, the colorfully clean pixel art, the rock and chiptune soundtrack, the tight platforming and combat gameplay, but this is stuff you all probably know already. If I'm going to talk about Shovel Knight, I have to talk about the things that made it so special for me personally. For one, I felt so in tune with the gameplay, it's almost like this thing was made for me. The running, jumps, the timing, even where the various secret treasures are hidden. It felt so intuitive, you could have told me I was playing a game from my childhood that I somehow forgot about, and I might have believed you. I tend to prefer my games linear when possible. I understand the appeal of open world stuff and the adventurous feeling it can give, but to me there's nothing like a game where every single beat feels like this purposely designed story that's being told via gameplay. That being said, the non-linear elements of Shovel Knight still work just fine for me because they give you options on where to go and what to do without making it too overwhelming. Even the towns you visit are just big enough to contain what they need to contain, no more, no less. The bosses. If you know me, you'll know I love bosses. And this game more than delivers. Each boss in this game has a completely different style that's reflected both in their appearance and their battle strategies. They even have levels that do a great job representing them and getting you hyped up for who you're about to fight next. I had fun fighting each and every one of these guys, with the Spectre Knight fight probably being my favorite. So now you know why I love Shovel Knight so much. In regards to the first campaign, oh yes, there's more. Remember when I said how the base game hooked me so well because of how intuitive it felt playing as Shovel Knight? Well, the second campaign, starring Plague Knight, is nothing like that. But guess what? I love that one too. Yeah, in contrast to Shovel Knight, who feels like a reincarnation of one of those tight SNES games you played as a kid, Plague Knight plays in a completely unique way that really threw me for a loop the first time I tried it out. But it makes sense. Plague Knight isn't nearly as much of a physical talent as Shovel, so instead he has to rely on his explosives for both combat and platforming purposes. This requires you to master a charge attack blast that will be vital for clearing jumps and reaching ledges. While Shovel had a number of useful magic abilities to choose from, Plague's upgrades focus almost solely on his explosives, allowing you to customize them in all kinds of different ways as you progress through the game. These modifications can radically change the way you play, from how your smaller bombs are dropped to what special effect is unleashed when launched by your charge explosion. Customization like this is the type of thing that can get intimidating for me personally, but it honestly wasn't too bad for me in this case. Some people may not like that you play through the same levels here as you did in the base campaign, but I think it actually works perfectly. Think about it. First we had to go through all those levels as the intuitive, classic epitome of a 2D platform character, Shovel Knight. Now we have to make our way through those same areas, albeit with some changes here and there, with a new character who plays completely differently than anything I've experienced. It's a whole different type of challenge. Oh, and by the way, there's still 2 other campaigns. The third you play as Spectre Knight, who once again comes with his own unique moveset that I'd probably place somewhere between Knight and Plague in terms of how difficult it is to get the hang of. The most notable thing being the slice mechanic that Knight uses to zip diagonally upwards into the air. Just like the other 2, it's an excellent campaign from start to finish, and even features brand new levels for those of you who may have been disappointed by the repeats with Plague Knight. As of this writing, I've shamefully not played the King Knight campaign yet, but come on, it's pretty much a guarantee that I'm gonna like it. The only possible negative thing I can think of off the top of my head is that the rooms that go dark repeatedly were a bit disorienting for me. I'm not sure why exactly, since I can really enjoy this type of mechanic like in A Shot in the Dark, but here it just felt a bit annoying for whatever reason. But hey, if that's the only thing I can think to complain about, I mean, this is like near perfection here. Shovel Knight is an awesome game, but that's pretty much the wrap up. I feel kind of bad for the game that's gonna have to follow it. Dead Space. Well, you heard it in the opening song, it's Resident Evil 4 in space. I mean, come on. Okay, so there may be a little bit more to it than that, but RE4 in space is a pretty accurate way to describe it. Even the devs wouldn't argue with you there, as one of the lead designers of the game has admitted that he drew a lot of inspiration from Capcom's 2005 survival action horror Tour de Force. For some reason, Dead Space never really grabbed my attention back when it first came out, though the fact I didn't have the means to play it at the time probably didn't help. However, when I heard that the game had a lot of similarities to RE4, one of my favorite games, it piqued my interest. I wouldn't say that I hate shooting games, but it's definitely a crapshoot on if one is going to click with me or not. Even then, I could admit that I'm not always the best at them. But with Dead Space, a game that certainly doesn't hesitate to throw you right into the fire, things clicked almost immediately. And yes, it's most likely due to the RE4 connection. That being said, it's not like Dead Space is merely a clone of another classic game, far from it. It does a great job introducing plenty of elements that makes it feel like its own unique creation. First thing that comes to mind is the combat system. Sure, the aiming and laser sight is extremely RE4, but just look at the weapons you're using. A plasma cutter that lets you cut at a horizontal or vertical angle at will. The Ripper, which lets you swing around a tethered saw blade to carve up enemies with continuous damage, and the powerful Contact Beam, which can be charged up to fire large kinetic blasts or even a ground-based AoE. We got a lot of stuff going on here. The environment in the story is very similar to Alien, taking place on a deserted spaceship that's being ravaged by grotesque and bloodthirsty mutants known as necromorphs, unrelated to xenomorphs. These creatures come in all sorts of disgusting varieties, all with their own special ways of trying to kill you. You got humanoid ones, tiny parasitic ones, enormous hulking ones, and these jerks who look pretty defenseless at first, but believe me, they could be a pain to deal with. The general approach to fighting these enemies may not be exactly what you'd expect. In most shooting games, what do you aim for? The head, right? Well, we don't do that here. Necromorphs generally have one weakness, and it's to dismember them. That means you'll be targeting those limbs first and foremost. Ah, now the design of that plasma cutter makes sense, right? Oh, and it works beautifully. Gotta be my favorite weapon in the game, and luckily it's your default one. All the other weapons and their various upgrades must be purchased in these virtual stores you occasionally run into. Aside from that, you're also equipped with the status module that lets you slow down enemies and certain objects, and these gravity boots that allow you to stick to walls and ceilings in special zero-G rooms, some of which require you to navigate quickly as your suit only has so much oxygen available. Speaking of the suit, notice anything on the back? It's your health bar. How sick is that? I don't think I've ever seen a more clever way to implement a UI into the visuals of the game itself. One thing I couldn't possibly go without mentioning is the navigation laser, that beautiful guiding light. A recurring problem I have in games that have larger areas to explore with multiple rooms is I often find myself getting lost. Well, sometimes I just miss instructions or forget where I'm going, or I can't remember where I've already been. Basically, I get lost easily. In Dead Space, however, it's just one simple button press and a magnificent guiding laser shoots forth and shows you the exact path to your destination. This was like a fantasy come true for me. I'm not saying every game needs something like this, but man, I loved it here, and it really helped me get through my playthrough without wasting a bunch of time wandering around because I didn't know where to go next. If there was one thing I could say was maybe a little disappointing about this game, it's the lack of bosses. There's big enemies, sure, but only a few proper big bosses in the entire game. Not a deal breaker or anything, and the bosses you do fight are actually pretty intense and engaging. It just would have been nice to have more. Before I wrap up, I feel like I should talk about Dead Space 2 since I also played that one. It was more Dead Space, which is a good thing, but not exactly a great thing? I don't know. While the first Dead Space to me was this exciting, groundbreaking thing that was really awesome to experience for the first time, Dead Space 2 didn't exactly feel like a big leap forward from that. It wasn't worse by any means, and they certainly did have some new additions, but overall, it just felt like more of the same. I hope that's not too controversial of an opinion. Oh, also, games. Please give me the option to have DLC items turned off. I don't want a million OP guns for free in my first playthrough. I had to be careful not to touch any of these things so I didn't feel like I was cheating. Well, who knows, with the remake of the first Dead Space coming sometime in the future, maybe I'll be able to recapture that exciting experience I had playing the original. Or maybe they'll ruin it. Condemned: Criminal Origins. When this game was first suggested to me, it was described as a beat up the homeless simulator. Well, that's not very nice. We can't do that, especially not on Christmas. But it is on the list, so it's sort of out of my hands. Condemned is a shooter game where you play as a law enforcement adjacent protagonist who finds himself framed for murder and then hunted down by his own precinct while he searches for the true culprit. On the surface, this doesn't really seem to stand out from the other FPS games of the time, but there are some quirks that give it more character. Rather than being provided weapons that you carry throughout the game, you're tasked with finding them yourself from the environment or off of enemies in each of the levels. These include melee weapons such as wooden planks, pipes, and sledgehammers, each with their own strengths and weaknesses. While it's generally up to you which weapons you want to use, some specific weapons, such as axes or crowbars, are actually required to progress through certain parts of the game. You can also find firearms, usually on enemies as they're trying to kill you with them. Make sure you get the gun out of their hands quickly, however, as the gun only has so many bullets, and will start to deplete with each shot that the enemy fires. Aside from the weapons, you also have a kick, which is usually saved for stunning enemies to drop whatever they're holding, and a long-range taser, which does the same thing but even better. It has a recharge time after every use, however, so spamming it is not an option, and you'll want to find a proper weapon ASAP. An element of the game I didn't expect was the detective part, where you have to use special devices to analyze scenes of interest. Here you have to look for unusual markings, stains, or any other types of clues that may help you in your investigation. I think that this was a neat idea for the most part, but occasionally it can get a bit finicky when you aren't looking at the correct object from the exact angle that the game wants you to. The story of the game is an intriguing one, if not also a bit confusing. The main target of the game is a serial killer who targets other serial killers by using their own elaborate methods of killing against them. That may sound a little familiar, but try not to think about that. Aside from that, there's also some bizarre stuff going on where people from the worst parts of the city are suddenly becoming uncontrollably feral and violent, apparently due to the mysterious sonic waves that are also killing the neighboring birds. These animal-like enemies are smarter than you'd think, often finding ways to ambush you and hide in places that are hard to see. They even fight in such a way that makes strategy in battle very important. You can't just run in and start swinging. You have to know when to block, when to dodge, and when to strike if you want to survive. Other than this, there's some side objectives of collecting birds and metal pieces, which were scored on at the end of each chapter. As we pursue the serial killer, we start to have what seem to be hallucinations of this monstrous creature. Further into the game we see more of these, and it starts to make us question if they might actually exist. We even find information about ourselves that may link us to them. Unfortunately, the game ends in kind of a strange way. I won't spoil it here, but let's just say it leaves a lot of those loose ends untied that you may have wanted to have explained. We don't even really get an explanation on why we've been collecting those birds and metal pieces. The levels are dark and gritty, which matches the tone and gameplay pretty well, though the constant rundown environments do get a little repetitive after a while. It really makes you grateful when you do get to see some different scenery. It's a game where you can get lost on occasion, but I think that's on purpose, since you're in a lot of dark, spooky environments, and the progression points usually make sense for the most part. There was this one time in this house that just felt weird though. Basically, you're just searching this attic and encounter a dead end. You fight an enemy and then wander around trying to figure out how to proceed. After wasting some time, you look back at the dead end and it's just gone. This isn't too bad the first time, but I actually had to redo this part, and the waiting was pretty annoying the second time around. As far as I can tell, you can't just run to a specific part of the house to make the obstruction go away any faster either. You literally just have to waste a few minutes wandering and then it'll eventually vanish on its own. That may not sound that bad, but you want to know why I had to do this twice in the first place? I actually encountered a soft lock. Basically what happened is I made my way to the attic. I was supposed to take a picture of some evidence, but I missed it and jumped back down to the ground floor in such a way that it was impossible to go back up. Even the stairs that I took to reach the attic originally were now sealed, meaning that the evidence needed to progress the game was now impossible to reach. All that being said, I did enjoy Condemned overall. It feels a lot like one of those old school FPS PC games, with some special quirks that make it more appealing to me than most of the modern FPS games we have nowadays. I would try out the sequel to see if any of those previously mentioned loose ties get, well, tied, but I've been told by expert sources that the second game is maybe not the best sequel. Well, we still got plenty of games to go, so we better get a move on. Bug Fables. For a lot of people, Paper Mario is a beloved yet conflicting video game series. Most people would agree that the first two titles for N64 and GameCube are both classic games. After that though, things get a little more divisive. Paper Mario to me is an exceedingly charming RPG that has a lot of the excess fat you'd often see in this genre trimmed, leaving only its purest parts. Its gameplay is simple, but still has enough to it that it feels engaging and satisfying to play. Mario has a bunch of cool partners that he meets along his journey, each a classic Mario creature with a ton of creativity added. They all have unique personalities and really fun designs that you never really get to see in other Mario series. Extend that concept to a whole world full of imaginative NPCs, memorable bosses, and a tight turn-based battle system that has everything you need for entertaining fights without ever getting too complicated. To make a long story short, the later releases strayed farther and farther away from a lot of the things that made the first two games so beloved. The traditional battle system was thrown out, and the artistic freedom allowed for the various characters in the games were limited severely. I wonder who decided that. Now, I personally really enjoyed Super Paper Mario, and I even had a lot of fun with Origami King. But I can definitely see why fans of the original two games long for that vintage Paper Mario style. Then along came Bug Fables, a game that attempts to recreate that classic Paper Mario feel while basing everything in an entirely unique world of insects. The art direction certainly passes the test, with clear and cute 2D character designs that feel probably most similar to Thousand Year Door. The battle system is pretty much a redone version of that turn-based style we've been craving, including those delicious timed input segments that make the fights so engaging. We've got what are the Bug Fable variations of flower points, star points, badge points, badges that grant special stats and abilities, food items that can be cooked and combined, hidden mystics that will grant good luck charms, basically the essentials are all here. That isn't to say Bug Fables doesn't do some things different. For one, we don't exactly have a Mario and his partners equivalent in the game. Instead of having one protagonist who slowly gains allies as they progress, here, we only ever have the three same permanent members in our party who are obtained very near the start of the game, and they all sort of split the duty as leader. On one hand, this is good because it means we'll always have the same three characters with us, giving us plenty of time to see them bond and grow over the course of the game, though I'll have to admit I do miss the process of gradually building your party with new faces every chapter. Luckily, our perma party of Kaboo the Beetle, Bee the Bee, and Leaf the Moth are a very likable bunch. The dialogue in the game is entertaining enough, though I have to admit it can get a bit wordy during little non-story moments where it doesn't really have to be. And since there's three talkative characters with us at all times, you may find yourself skipping a lot of the excess small talk. It's not that I don't enjoy their back and forths, but sometimes they back and forth in a fillery way that isn't that entertaining. The fighting system also has some new additions, most notably the position order of each character in your party giving them a status effect. The member leading the front has an increased attack, but will also be targeted the most often. The bug in the back of the group, however, will be less likely to be targeted, while also having their attacks be slightly weaker. There's also something about the battles overall that feel a little more complex than you might expect. In Paper Mario, I always confidently knew exactly what each attack will do to each enemy and vice versa, but in Bug Fables, partly due to the dynamic status of each character at any given moment, I often find myself unsure during battle exchanges. Throw in the whole rallying thing and it gets more confusing. The descriptions also aren't always the most helpful either. A numbnail. I hear numbnail sedatives go for a lot of berries on the market. I'll try to take some for myself when Kaboo flips it out of its shell. I tried that already. Well, that's insinuating that it can work, so maybe we should turn relay, try it again. Nope. Item and badge descriptions also occasionally leave out details that you don't find out about until after you've equipped them and tried them out manually. Alright, well, we're gonna do the abomination, see what happens. I killed V. Wait a minute, that's not a bunch of TP, that was like 10. That wasn't worth it at all. See, this is why they need to be more specific with the items and badges. They need to say, we'll deal this damage, but then we'll give you this much TP. They shouldn't just say, does this, but gives a bunch of that. Like, that's way too vague. I want a refund. Aside from that, you will encounter the occasional little finicky things, such as the dynamic camera being delayed at times. It's a little late in showing you what's being turned. Like, it should probably zoom. Yeah, see? Like, I didn't know it had turned all the way. Enemies preemptively attacking before their allies have finished disappearing from the screen. Oh, see? Now they caught me that time. And the way the dialogue skip button is used. It's the same button as using your special ability outside, such as a leaf shield, so there are times where you'll be holding this button down, something triggers dialogue, and then you'll auto skip over it by accident. And they end up... Whoops. The game was definitely made for experienced Paper Mario players, as the difficulty here seems a bit higher for the most part. If that wasn't enough, they even include a bunch of optional secret bosses to provide even more of a challenge. While I think this is cool for the most part, the one thing I'm not so sure about is how they balance experience points. In Paper Mario, if you get so strong that enemies are pushovers, they'll only provide you with a single XP point after battle, which makes sense. In Bug Fables, however, enemies that can still put up a good challenge and chunk your health away will often give you hardly anything, while others that you defeat with ease pay handsomely just because you barely started encountering them more recently. With all that in mind, I have to say that Bug Fables is a really awesome tribute and spiritual sequel to the classic Paper Mario series overall. It's fun, challenging, charming, and clearly made with a lot of love. And any small blemishes you might run into should be prefaced with the fact that this was made by an indie team, nowhere near the team power and budget of a Mario game, so the fact this even exists is an awesome gift to the world. Plus it's GameCube controller compatible with the inputs and everything, so that's just bonus points right there. Thank you for your services, Bug Fables crew. I'm looking forward to your future releases. Eternal Darkness. I only played Eternal Darkness briefly before when I was younger. I thought it was a pretty cool horror game at the time with some interesting gimmicks, but I got lost after only a chapter or two and never picked the game up again, until now. I've heard a lot of good things about this game over the years. It has a pretty big cult following, so it's about time I see what I've been missing out on. Eternal Darkness has an interesting narrative that's told in a really unique way. You play as Alex, who is investigating the mansion of her recently murdered grandfather to find clues about what happened to him. She soon stumbles upon a book that houses a dark history of events, and it's in these pages that the bulk of the game takes place. You go from decade to decade, person to person, reliving the tragic events of these characters as they try their best to stop a dark god from being resurrected. Okay, so right off the bat, this game has an amazing gimmick. How it works is you have a sanity meter that can deplete over time as scary things happen, and if your sanity meter gets low enough, you'll start to hallucinate in various ways, many of which include breaking the fourth wall to the player behind the controller. Sometimes you'll be playing and simply hallucinate that there's a bunch of ammo on the floor, or that an enemy has been made tiny. But other times, the hallucinations get much more visceral, such as the game claiming that your data has been erased, or that the video connection has suddenly been lost. I think my favorite of all has to be when you're tricked into thinking that the game's ended and you need to wait for the sequel to come out to continue the story. I love stuff like this. Now, the game doesn't actually use tank controls, but somehow the gameplay does feel a bit sluggish and clunky all the same. You can run, but have a stamina meter which leaves you very vulnerable when drained. When attacking, you're given an option to aim for the various limbs or head of the enemies in a rigid grid selection sort of way. Depending on which character you're playing as, you'll be using a slew of different weapons, from melee to guns. You'll also be able to use this cursed tome to use magic spells. These can do anything from heal you, create a shield, break magic barriers, or even create an AoE attack. The way you create these spells can be a bit confusing as the menu isn't the most intuitive, and you even have to set shortcuts to the spells manually, which I found weird. Shouldn't new spells just be saved automatically once you've created them? That being said, I do find the crafting mechanic interesting, combining the runes you find in such a way to create the desired effect. For instance, summon plus creature summons, well, a creature. A different one depending on the amount of power you put into it. Most of these spells can be found in-game via these recipes, but you can actually try to guess spells ahead of time to find them secretly. Using the spells is kind of weird though. Once you initiate a spell, your magic is used, and then you have to stay still while it activates. If you move even an inch before it's finished, the spell will not trigger, wasting your magic. I wish they had just locked your character in place while this was happening, because there were so many times that I moved by accident, botching the spell. I get that they probably wanted to give you the option to abandon a spell and run from enemies, but I'd rather have just committed and get locked into place, to be honest. The chapters in this game felt like kind of a mixed bag for me. Sometimes they were fun to get through, other times not so much. It's easy to get lost or stuck on what you're supposed to do next because the game isn't always clear about things. One time I was playing as this architect who's supposed to be examining the various rooms in this underground area. When I had gotten to the final room, I didn't understand what I was doing wrong as it wasn't giving me the prompt. But as it turned out, I needed to be in this very specific spot on this bridge for the option to appear. When I casted the spell and suddenly the blue effigy became visible, I went to that room with the key and randomly a bridge was built for no reason and I was able to grab the key. And that's how we got to this place. Wait, what is this? Oh my god. We had to go to the middle, to this specific part of the bridge to survey the area. Roberto has completed his survey, now he can return to the surface. Right, okay. So that's where we missed, guys. One little tiny piece of the room in the middle of the bridge, which you're probably going to be running past because there was enemies on the same bridge. Another time I was wondering why a magic barrier hadn't disappeared after I thought I had solved the puzzle, so I ran all over this pyramid thing trying to figure out what else I had to do. I eventually came to find that I just had to walk a bit closer to the barrier to trigger it into vanishing, even though that wasn't something that usually happened. The game has the usual ups and downs you'd find in an older survival horror title, but there were a couple moments that actually drove me a bit crazy. For one, the game doesn't have any autosave. This is okay, especially since you're allowed to save whenever you want, so long as there aren't any enemies nearby. That is until I came across this glitch in a specific chapter where for some reason the game suddenly wouldn't let me save at all, no matter if I was in a safe room or not. It persisted for the entire chapter too, but luckily went away after I completed it. But you want to know what really made me lose it? This boss. This freaking boss. I don't even know where to begin. It doesn't seem that crazy at first. He summons attacks, you dodge, he summons zombies, you kill them, and then use a spell to attack the boss when he's flashing and vulnerable. Except it's not that simple. Fact is, if you waste time taking the zombies out and then try to use your spell, chances are the boss isn't going to be vulnerable anymore by the time it reaches him. The window to attack it is very tiny. So just use the spell first, right? That doesn't work either, because if the zombies see you while you're performing the spell, and they will, then you will take sanity damage and your spell gets interrupted. Oh, okay, well, how about we try going behind the boss then? That way the zombies won't see us and we'll be free to attack. Sure, we could try that. Oh look, the boss has decided to never start flashing since we're behind him now. Why? Why? I don't know why. The only reason I was able to get through this boss is because of help from my chat while I was streaming. They suggested a combination of spells that I wouldn't have known to use. Apparently you can create a shield that will block the zombie stairs, letting you use magic against the boss without being interrupted. This did help, but even then the timings for everything still felt extremely strict and I still had a lot of trouble. I think I spent about an hour on this boss alone and it was easily the hardest part of the game for me. Wanna know the real kicker? This was the same chapter that the no saving glitch happened. I was luckily simulating the game on Dolphin and thus was able to use save states to get around it, but lord, imagine if I didn't have them. Anyway, I don't want to focus too much on those bad moments. While a bit rough in parts, it had an interesting story and I thought it was a really cool idea for a game overall. I'd love to see a modern day developer take a crack at this same concept. Imagine the potential for all the meta hallucinations with today's technology.
On the 9th day of Jaysmas.
Okay. What?
Your right hand comes off?
Resident Evil.
Village. So we already covered RE4 in space. Now let's take a look at the latest game in the Resident Evil series, which also happens to take a lot from 4. Resident Evil is probably one of my favorite game series, but after RE4, the series seemed to be heading more and more in a direction that I was not a fan of. RE5 was okay for the most part, but the forced action co-op elements required a lot of changes that I didn't really care for. Relying so heavily on your partner, who happens to be a mediocre CPU in single player mode, and being forced to use items and switch weapons in the middle of battle, instead of in a traditional survival horror pause screen, being two of the big ones. Then along came Resident Evil 6, and no. I'm not going to talk about that one. Look, I gave it a fair chance, I played it, and believe me, one session was more than enough. Then there was RE7, and you know what? I actually thought that this was a great return to form for the series. Now, I wouldn't say I prefer Resident Evil being an FPS game, but they did a pretty good job translating it here. The creepy visuals are nice and detailed, the tone and setting feel a lot more classic survival horror, and the fresh concept of a Resident Evil game taking place entirely outside of the spectrum of the previous titles was really interesting, till the ending. I did still have a few problems with 7, most of it stemming from the awkwardness I had adapting to the new playstyle. The enemy variety isn't all that great, mostly comprising of these big bumbling mold monsters, and when you do get some enemy variety, oh god, I hate these bugs. At random moments, the game likes to put you in a rush, making you run from hazards and giving you little time to soak in the environment and think about what you're supposed to be doing, which I felt was more annoying than scary. Did I go the right way this time? I'm already lost. Hey, there we go. I think... Can you stop grabbing me? You're like the freaking zombies in RE2 Remake on hardcore mode. Oh my lord. See, like, this is just annoying. This isn't scary to me. I remember the same freaking thing. Like, come on. Can you chill? Can you, like, let me take in the atmosphere and examine this place? This is only made worse by the fact that you still can't pause to use items and switch weapons, even when examining locks and other key items. I don't remember where I'm supposed to go with this. Oh right, and the game doesn't pause when you examine things, of course. Better be quick before you get attacked. And now there's Village. And what do you know? I actually really love this game. On the surface you may think that it may not be all that different from RE7 since they were clearly done in the same engine, but believe me, there are a lot of differences here. In a nutshell, RE8 feels like they took RE7, ironed out most of the stuff I had issues with, and then injected it with a big healthy dose of RE4. And I don't just mean conceptually. Even the feel of the game harkens back to that wondrous GameCube title. The enemies have this mob mentality intelligence to them, much like the Ganados did, attacking you in groups with deliberate attacks and movements. These enemies also flinch at your shots and can be stunned effectively when hitting them in the right spots, bringing back that hectic yet strategic run-and-gun gameplay from 4 as well. Oh, and guess what? You can pause to use and organize items and weapons in a familiar cache case. Thank you, Capcom. It only took you a few games to get your marbles back together. Even aside from the gameplay, the events that happen here also feel so much more memorable than the ones from the last few Resident Evil games. Much like how RE4 had 3 main sections to the game, the village, the castle, and the island, each with their own unique environment and big baddie, RE8 goes a similar route, albeit with 5 main areas overall instead. There's just so many notable characters and places in this game. Heisenberg is this goofy yet charming magnetic wizard who I feel doesn't get talked about nearly enough. And I swear, if they ever did a movie adaptation with him, Nicolas Cage would be the only choice.
Your thing. Take me out like the others, and then he gets to go and save Rose, right?
The House Beneviento may be the shortest main segment of the game, but it's pretty hard to forget. Here your weapons are taken away entirely and you're put through the ringer in a much scarier part of the game that feels like a callback to those older survival horror titles where you feel helpless and desperate to escape the dangers that lurk in the dark. And then there's Castle Dimitrescu, whose long corridors and elaborate puzzle rooms will fulfill that craving for some classic Resident Evil mansion. Oh, and there's a giant vampire lady chasing you around who everyone seems to be in love with for some reason. I don't get it. I almost don't want to go into too much more detail because the game is such a fun adventure, I want people to be able to experience it for themselves. No, seriously, a lot of the moments in this game straight up feel like a theme park ride. The village itself even acts as a brilliant centerpiece and hub to all the other areas in the game. Between the main objectives, you'll be regularly revisiting the village, and it's done in such a way that it doesn't feel tedious or boring at all. As you progress through the game, you'll acquire new tools that will slowly open more of the village and let you gain new weapons and treasures. There's even a number of side objectives available if you feel inclined to go after them, such as discovering the most prized family heirlooms of each of the 4 families, hunting exceptionally rare animals to make gourmet meals that will give you special stat boosts, and even battling special souped up mini-bosses that will drop loads of treasure. The visuals in the game are stunning even on my last gen PS4. The game has a number of epic boss fights, and you can once again upgrade your weapons with the return of a merchant character, this time in the form of the Duke. This game is just awesome. Okay, the story can get a bit just plain bad at times, which is kind of hard to get into without spoilers. Chris is really dumb in this game. But yeah, as long as we can ignore that, overall, it's a really grand experience. The only thing that was a bit disappointing for me personally was the very last section of the game. Once again, not going deep into spoilers, but the final mission of the game starts with you playing as Chris, charging through the village at night Call of Duty style. This is one part of the game that just didn't feel like it belonged for me. Every other section was introducing a new environment or enemy or something, but here we're just fighting through the same village as we always have except with Chris. Sure, he has more powerful weapons, but even that doesn't feel like it's quite right. If you wanted to show this contrast between the less experienced Ethan and a decked out veteran Chris, then they should have just made this part of the game a cakewalk, blasting through enemies like nothing. If you're gonna lean in that direction, you gotta go all the way, man. I think this part could have honestly worked out better as post-game content, much like the story DLC in RE7, separating it from the main game, but still being a neat little side thing to do as an epilogue. You know, as I'm working on this review, Resident Evil Village is actually up for nomination as Game of the Year. Wow, imagine that! The perfect final addition to all the ways that RE8 is like the modern day successor to RE4. Well, unless it doesn't win, and that would ruin everything, but I'm sure it'll win. I'm sure it'll... Let's move on to the next game.
Bayonetta.
When I first thought about playing this game, I was warned. No, I was nigh forbidden from doing so. I was told to stay far, far away from this game. Why? Well, let's see. I guess I didn't do all that great during my playthrough of Metal Gear Rising. I was able to brute force my way to the end, but I never really got a handle on the gameplay, particularly the slicing gimmick. But this isn't the main reason. The real reason I was warned is because I did a playthrough of the original Devil May Cry for PS2, and let's just say I sorta had a rough time. I'm not sure what it was, but for the life of me, I just could not get any semblance of a grip on how the game was supposed to work. The whole game is about styling and combos, and I couldn't do a single one. And because I couldn't do a single one, I was punished exponentially as the game went on. Usually I love bosses, they're probably my favorite things in games, but here I just didn't know what the heck I was supposed to do with these things. I couldn't get a read on anything. Ironically, I had an easier time with the final boss than any of the others in the game, but that took a lot of pain and struggling to get to. The only thing that saved my playthrough, that one glimmer of hope in the entire run, was the grenade launcher. Blast and dodge, baby. Blast and dodge. So anyway, to cut a long story short, DMC was sort of a torturous experience for me, and I was told that if that's how I felt about it, then Bayonetta would feel very much the same. Well, guess what, Fact? You were wrong. I really enjoyed Bayonetta. Yeah, I don't know what you were worried about. I had a good time. So most of you are probably at least somewhat aware of Bayonetta at this point. You play as this badass witch who is constantly either playfully flirting or insulting her enemies as she confidently beats them to a pulp, often both at the same time. There's this whole storyline about her having to fight off these vengeful angels who are trying to use her as a sacrifice to resurrect some great creator or something, and there's this little girl who suddenly appears and keeps calling Bayonetta Mummy a lot. No, seriously, about 95% of her dialogue is literally just, Mummy, Mummy.
Mummy, 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 Mummy.
Do you like it when she calls you Mummy?
But anyway, the story isn't really what's important here. What's important is the gameplay, and the gameplay happens to be an excellent combination of challenging yet fun. Yeah, I'm not sure what it is exactly with DMC that gave me so much trouble, but in Bayonetta, everything just clicks a lot more naturally for me. The dodging, the combos, the big punish moves, the timing, it all just makes sense. Now, I'm not saying that I just plowed through the game no problem. I died plenty of times. If you're not paying attention, the game will make you pay for it. You're not even safe during cutscenes, as they'll often end with an enemy in mid-attack, chunking your health with a sucker punch before the fight's even begun, unless you were mashing the dodge button in advance. While I did enjoy the game overall, there were a lot of little things about the game that irked me as well. The ranking system in general is super harsh, punishing you for the smallest things, such as accidentally skipping past battles, or even for simply using health. How many games can you think of where you get points taken away from healing? In most games, optional hidden side missions are only there to give you bonus rewards if you happen to find them. In Bayonetta, there's tons of secretive missions that are easily missed, which only end up subtracting from your total rank at the end of the chapter, making it so even though you may have gotten lots of silver and gold ranks, the missed missions tanks you down to a bronze or even a stone statue. It's not my fault those missions got skipped, I didn't see them. There's also some pretty BS insta-deaths in the game. Some that happen during normal gameplay, and others that happen from sudden QuickTime events that you often don't see coming. Usually the button prompt is just fine, a clear image of the button you need to press, but for some reason, they decide to show the entire freaking controller at an awkward angle during these QTEs. Whenever this happens, I find myself blanking out and having to scan down the controller to see what buttons it wants me to hit, instead of just seeing a clear direction arrow and a button, and instantly knowing what to do. The most valuable battle mechanic in the game is Witch Time, which is activated by perfectly dodging an opponent's attack at the last second. This slows down time, giving you an opening to punish an enemy that would otherwise punish you for daring to combo them outside of Witch Time. While this is awesome when it works, the game is strangely inconsistent about which enemy attacks will grant you Witch Time and which won't. It's something that you'll have to figure out through trial and error, and even then it just seems to be arbitrary which attacks it works on. While this is only a minor annoyance for the most part, and made up for with the fact that every enemy has something that you can witch time off of, there is one particular duo of enemies where this annoyance becomes a full-blown issue. Gracious and Glorious, these two assholes are souped up versions of what is already probably the most aggressive and deadly non-boss enemies in the game. Heck, you could argue they're even worse to deal with than any of the bosses, and I'll tell you why. Pretty much every enemy in the game can be stunned in one way or another. I found this roundhouse kick in particular to be super effective to just about everything. Even bosses would get stunned by it, leaving them open for a large follow-up hit. These guys, however, refuse to flinch from anything you do, which is only made worse by the fact that they attack with incredible speed. You try even the simplest combo and you're getting hit. Okay, easy solution, right? We just have to dodge their attacks and witch time their asses. Except that's the thing. These are the only enemies in the entire game whose attacks you cannot witch time off of. Yes, that includes the bosses. Yes, this includes the final boss. Now you see my problem, right? It's like these enemies were specifically designed to be dealt with using witch time, yet somehow none of their attacks will grant you it. Now, if I'm super careful and attack from a distance, I can slowly chip away their health while staying safe. But that's just not fun. It's tiring and monotonous. I honestly wonder if this was an accident, as I can't see why they would be programmed like this on purpose. Another thing I wish was a little different was the way that magic is handled, or rather your lack of options with it as a new player. At default, you only have a single use of your magic meter, which is to perform a powerful torture attack on enemies once it's filled up. Other than that, you're unable to do anything with it unless you purchase specific upgrades in the shop. Keep in mind, these upgrades can get quite expensive, with the most helpful and fun being so expensive that you can save up for the entire game and maybe end up with 1 or 2 at the most. I always felt like I was letting my magic meter go to waste because I didn't have any abilities to utilize it, especially on those larger enemies and bosses that didn't let you use the torture attack on them. I get that the pro players would probably get so many points from chapters that they'd easily be able to afford all the best gear, but most people aren't going to achieve that on a first playthrough. Bayonetta is very much a trial and error type of game. Ironically, the expensive upgrades was also an issue I had in Devil May Cry, although in that case, the result of not being able to afford them was a lot more detrimental to the player overall. I feel like if they gave you another default ability that used magic from the start, or maybe dropped the prices in the shop to a more reasonable level, then it would give first-time players a lot more fun options in combat. All those little gripes aside, I really did enjoy Bayonetta a lot more than most of those other recent character action games. The gameplay is great once you learn it, the characters are fun, and there's some really epic boss fights to keep the excitement up throughout. I think it goes without saying, but I'm really looking forward to playing more games in this series.
No More Heroes 3.
And finally, the moment we've all been waiting for, the final game in the 12 Days of Jaysmas. I'll just say it right off the bat, this is my personal game of the year. And if you know just how much of a Suda51 fan I am, and how much fun I had playing this game on release, that's probably not too surprising. So why has it taken me this long to review it? Well, I'll be honest, I liked the game so much, I felt intimidated about reviewing it. I wasn't sure if I'd be able to do justice to what was such an amazing experience for me. But then I realized something. I don't need to do this huge elaborate review to tell everyone how much I love No More Heroes 3. I don't need to put in a bunch of extra work doing a silly skit, or stay up till sunrise multiple nights writing out an hour-long review. I just have to say what I liked about it. So of course it only makes sense that I did this huge elaborate thing leading up to the review of it. What's wrong with me? In order to properly review No More Heroes 3, I'm going to have to briefly go over the previous games in the series, bite-sized versions of the reviews I never did. If you've known me for more than a day, you've probably already heard my thoughts on No More Heroes 1 and 2, so sorry in advance, but here they are again. The first No More Heroes is a fantastic game, and the main reason for this is because of Suda51's distinct style of writing, the one-of-a-kind characters that only he could create, and that unorthodox grasshopper flair that's better experienced than attempting to explain. The bosses in this game are all unique and memorable in each their own way. The pre-introductions at the start of their levels give you just a taste of what's to come, with the boss's name, their silhouette, and a single voice line. This is a great setup to get you hyped for what's to come.
What's that in your hand? A toy?
Later, when you reach the boss, we get to see an engaging cutscene of Travis interacting with his current target, letting you get to know the ranked assassin a bit before you get to killing them. And speaking of killing them, Travis sure as hell kills them, usually in a creatively dramatic and gory fashion. I'll be frank, the actual gameplay isn't the strongest aspect of the game, but this isn't unusual for most Grasshopper titles. It seems like Suda tends to focus first and foremost on the writing, and then figuring out how to implement as many of the numerous crazy ideas he has currently floating in his head as possible. Then, he makes sure to throw in some kick-ass music, and hires various artists who often have had little to no experience in the video game industry, showcasing their art to the gaming world. Oh yeah, and then they figure out a way to make the gameplay work. In all seriousness, No More Heroes gameplay is completely serviceable, and I wouldn't call it bad by any means. It's simple to learn, and consistent for the most part. It's just a bit more rigid and shallow than what you'd probably expect from something like a AAA hack and slash game. But hey, you can suplex enemies with various pro wrestling moves, and there's the dark side special moves obtained by occasionally matching up a random slot machine chance to spice up the gameplay once in a while. There's an extremely bare-bones open world which serves as your map between different places in the game. It's where you spend most of your time as you go around doing various side jobs to earn money for your next ranking fight, mostly consisting of menial tasks that are more silly to see than they are fun to play. But then again, who said that part-time jobs were supposed to be fun? And to be honest, it is actually kind of interesting to see just how many different goofy side jobs Travis ends up doing between levels. The game may feel grindy at times, but it's never too much, and the bosses are more than enough of a reward to urge you to rack up money for the next entry fee. To go deeper into why I really enjoy this game would mean explaining a lot of very specific moments, but this is a No More Heroes 3 review, so we gotta keep this ball rolling. No More Heroes 2 is extremely similar to the first game in that it basically uses the skeleton of No More Heroes 1 as a base to work off of, but it also makes some significant tweaks which change the overall feeling of the game, in some ways better but in other ways worse. The soundtrack to the game is just as excellent as the first, while also stepping in an entirely different direction. It utilizes songs with more live instrumentation and has a generally grittier sound than the cleaner, more produced feeling soundtrack of the original. They're both great in their own way. The visuals have had a noticeable budget increase, and there's more details on the characters and environments this time around. Though that isn't to say the first game looks worse, both have very appealing art styles. The open world was scrapped completely, opting instead for a streamlined map menu that lets you instantly go from place to place. The entry fees have also been removed, allowing you to proceed from one ranked mission to the next whenever you feel like it. Though that doesn't mean you won't have a reason to earn money, as you can still use it to upgrade your stats at the gym and purchase new beam katanas. Replacing the wacky side jobs of the first game are these NES-style mini-games. You kind of lose the irony of seeing an exceptional and deadly assassin running around town doing demeaning tasks to earn cash, but most people would agree that these retro-style games are a lot more fun to play overall. Some people would say that No More Hero 2's gameplay is better than the first, but I don't know if I would agree with that exactly. It's certainly flashier, and in some ways it does feel less rigid, but there's something about the second that just doesn't feel as consistent as the first for me. In No More Heroes 1, I know exactly what I have to do in order to stun and grab an opponent for a suplex, but in No More Heroes 2, it seems to be a roll of the dice on whether it'll work for me or not. I came to find out later that many of the bosses in the game can't even be grabbed at all. See, when the boss is blocking in a specific way, that was the sign in No More Heroes 1 to hit your stun move on them to get into the wrestling move position. Like that, you'd think that would be it. But in this one, it doesn't work like that, and I'm not really sure how it works. Compare that to No More Heroes 1, where every boss you encounter has their own special suplex that you perform on them. For me, personally, the gameplay feels, rather than an upgrade, more like a side grade from the original. Speaking of bosses, while there were certainly some cool ranked assassins in 2, the overall roster doesn't feel quite as iconic as the ones you face off in the first game. In fact, overall, it just didn't strike me the same way that the first game did. I could maybe say it's because the writing in this game feels a bit more forcefully edgy and try-hardy than in the first one. Or I could say that there's just a lot of neat little stylistic touches in the first game that seems to be missing here, like the way that the bosses are introduced. In No More Heroes 1, as we approached a ranked fight, we get that creepy disembodied voice whispering the boss's name and the silhouette, that brief voice clip. It's quick, snappy, and gives you just enough of a taste to get you really curious about who you're about to face off against. Instead of that, in 2, before a ranking level, you just sit and hear Sylvia wax philosophical, which at times seems to tell you less about who you're about to fight, and more that she took creative writing classes in college. Most of the time, you don't even know the name of who you're fighting until after you've killed them already. It's no wonder I had trouble remembering many of these bosses after the first time I played it. I still enjoy No More Heroes 2, it has a lot of what made the first game fun, and even introduced some cool new things like playing as Shinobu and Henry for a few boss fights, but it just feels like it's missing something, and that's actually easy to explain. Suda51 had hardly any involvement in it. Yeah, he wasn't the director or even a head writer for the game, leaving the bulk of its creation to other members of Grasshopper Manufacture. I'm sure he had some of his own ideas and plot threads thrown in there, but at the time he was just too busy on the development of Shadows of the Dam to give much more creative input. But you know what Suda wasn't too busy for? You know what game saw him slamming right into the creative driver's seat as both the head writer and director for the first time in over 10 years? Well, Travis Strikes Again, but also No More Heroes 3. Now I'm just gonna say very briefly that I loved Travis Strikes Again. I know it's a very divisive game for a lot of people, and I know it has its flaws, but it was the game that pushed me to buy a Switch and made me fall in love with Grasshopper Manufacture all over again. The writing, concept, and overall style of the game felt like a great resurgence for Suda. Now, I already did a 27-minute review on that game, so I'm not gonna go over it again any further than that. Let's just get to the main course. And look at that, even the Joy-Con warning screen here has that special grasshopper spin on it. You did it, guys, great job. 10 out of 10, we don't even need to see anymore, 10 out of 10. Come on. This is a clear sign of perfection here, come on. Okay, but seriously, I'm not exactly sure where to start, so let's just take off from the beginning, and then we'll start listing a bunch of cool stuff. The intro is great. Rather than anything immediately No More Heroes specific, we hear Travis talking about a game that he used to play as a child named Deathman, while he browses clips of it on YouTube to try to remember how it ends. This may not seem like much on the surface, but this introspective conversation Travis is having with the player is important, because it tells us that this is indeed the same, somewhat more matured Travis that we first encountered in Travis Strikes Again. Hooray for committing to character growth. After this, we get the animation from the iconic The Return trailer, which introduces Fu as the main antagonist of the game, as well as his crew of alien space felons. Honestly, every cutscene in this game is great. It's probably the strongest part of the game, and the whole series for that matter. When it comes to the visual design of the in-game models, I do have to admit that I'm a little conflicted. I think the actual designs of the characters are still great, but the hardware does seem to struggle to do them justice, and the hair physics can be a bit crude at times. When I first jumped into the actual gameplay, I was a little worried at first, not because I thought it was bad, but because I wasn't playing particularly great. As I continued and got more used to it, however, the gameplay felt very satisfying, and the moves were very fun to pull off. I think that this game might just be a bit harder than the first two, which would explain the learning curve. The standard difficulty in 3 is even set to bitter this time, which was initially reserved as the hard difficulty in 1 and 2. As the game goes on and you gain more abilities, as well as a better mastery of the controls, I think it's safe to say that this game has the best combat in the entire series. Travis dices up enemies in a flurry of pretty strikes. You can even walk while charging, which is a real game changer, and he has a perfect dodge reward system that basically gives him witch time from Bayonetta. Oh, and not only does Travis have his signature wrestling moves, check this out. Your punishing suplexes will actually recharge your beam katana, giving you a great option for keeping your momentum going during battle, without having to stop to recharge manually. How sick is that? Oh, and did I mention that the jump and the death glove from TSA makes a return? Yep. Now unfortunately you only get 4 of the skill chips in this game, but they did make a pretty good selection. Players may also be disappointed that there's only 1 beam katana to use, but I personally think that all the other combat elements more than make up for it, including a number of additional special moves that you can gain from upgrading. One of the weaker aspects of No More Heroes 1 and 2 is the lack of enemy variety, mostly comprising of thug with sword, thug with gun, and occasionally big thug. Here it's an entirely different story. You have a comparatively huge array of different aliens to fight here, each with their own tricks and weaknesses. This helps avoid a lot of the monotony encountered in past entries. Each No More Heroes game has its own way of teasing upcoming bosses, and 3 is no exception. We're shown all the bosses during the opening animation, and are told their names right up front. And as a preamble before ranked fights, they do something very different as well. We see a flashback of Fu interacting with the boss that you're about to face, showing off surprisingly intimate moments between them.
And when I left the shop, there was a white lighthouse. But as for where that place was, I have no idea at all.
That's a nice story. Let's go out there and find that lighthouse together.
I think this does a fine job letting us get to know the bosses a bit more, and even giving us a glimpse of what Fu is like when he's not in front of an audience. The open world. Look, I get it. It's not the prettiest open world. It's glitchy, it's stuttery, it's not exactly filled to the brim with content, but damn it, I think it works. One of the reasons I think it works is because of how levels are done in this game. Usually you'd have to go around town, doing tasks and side missions to build up money so you can pay for an entry fee to get into a proper level and then fight the boss, which admittedly could get a bit grindy at times. Here, however, the missions you're required to do out and around the town are the proper levels, as most of the boss fights begin immediately after you've paid your entry fee. And when they don't, it's usually because there's something special going on. I think this does a great job balancing things out so it doesn't feel like you're spending too much time just mowing down normal enemies to work your way to the boss. When you're out traversing the world, you're doing multiple things at once. Sure, there isn't nearly as much interactivity as in something like GTA or Red Dead, but you are given lots of things to do. You're doing those iconic menial side jobs to make cash because that's funny, including suplexing crocodiles. You're picking up collectibles such as scorpions and death cards. You're planting trees that you can Mario 64 jump off of later. You're destroying Easter Island heads. You're playing hide and go seek with Doppelganger from TSA who's doing JoJo poses everywhere. You're blasting giant space aliens in a Gundam. The game gives you plenty of side stuff to keep you busy while you're exploring around and doing the required missions at the same time. And then when you head back home, you get to immediately fight the boss. And even the bike controls in this game is a lot more fluid. It's not amazing, but it's a lot better than in 1. And it's actually kind of fun to see Travis crash and fly off his bike sometimes. I can understand why people might miss the more proper boss levels that lead up to the fights, but I do think they introduced a proper alternative here. Besides, the most important part was always the bosses, right? And don't worry, they deliver in the boss category. The aliens all have really cool designs that stand out from one another. And minor spoiler alert, but not all the bosses you face will be the aliens. Did you always wish you could see Travis face off against the Galactic Musical Chairs champion? Well, now you can. You suddenly get the urge for a genre change? Does FPS horror tickle your fancy? No? What about turn-based RPG? Yeah, this is definitely a Suda51 game. Travis's interactions with the bosses are as entertaining as ever, but at the same time, it's interesting to see an older and not so bloodthirsty Travis try to talk down a lot of the bosses before their inevitable fight, once again emphasizing how Travis has evolved. This next thing might evoke a mixed response, but they brought back the visual novel segments from TSA. These were probably my favorite thing from TSA, so as you can guess, I was very hyped about this. At this point, I feel like I need to start forming my overall thoughts about the game. I will say I had a very different idea of how I thought this game was going to be and how the final product turned out. I thought that this was going to be a proper climax to the series, something with an immense amount of finality that would finally draw the curtain to a close in a very blatant way. We didn't really get that. The game was very, very over the top in terms of the outright craziness, and that's saying a lot for Grasshopper. It's very tongue-in-cheek. While there are some great character moments, and they bring a lot from the previous games back into this one, including TSA, this didn't really feel like a final send-off for the series. I can't really explain why without getting into spoilers, but let's just say the game ends on this huge tease that I honestly can't tell if it's legit or just an enormous troll by Suda. Whatever the case, while the ending may not be what I expected, I had an amazing time playing through the game. I can't think of the last time I was so immersed, gleefully enjoying every bizarre cutscene and subversive moment as they happened one after another, and always hungry to see what was coming next. Fu was a fantastic rival for Travis, who was built up unlike any of the other main antagonists from the previous 2 games. In No More Heroes 1, the antagonist is a twist character that we only get to hear the backstory to once we finally reached them. In 2, we have a vague idea of who the final boss is, but they end up being this flat 2D character that's really just there as endgame boss fight fodder. In 3, however, we get Fu's origins right up front. In fact, the way his story is first presented to us in the Return Return trailer, it's framed as if it's an entirely unique game and that Fu and his friend Damon are the protagonists, before revealing at the end that it was a No More Heroes 3 trailer the entire time. I thought that that was brilliant. Along with that, we get all these little moments between Fu and his alien buddies, which show that there's depth to his character. He may act like a cold, uncaring tyrant, and he may have some anger issues, but this dude legit cares about his friends, and he's not so keen on this beam sword otaku cutting them down. Even Fu's first confrontation with Travis is pretty crazy, with the overpowered alien completely wrecking Team Travis and giving you plenty of motivation to want to work your way to rank 1 and kick his ass. I'd argue Fu is the most fleshed out main antagonist in the whole series, save for maybe Dr. Juvenile in Travis Strikes Again. If I was being impartial, I wouldn't rate No More Heroes 3 a 10 out of 10 or even a 9 out of 10. I can even admit that the final battle with Fu might unfortunately be the most sloppily designed boss fight in the game. But for me, personally, this was the most excited I've been playing a new game for a very long time, and all the hype moments that culminate at the end of the game more than made up for it. Plus the Rocky montage with Notorious. Notorious. He is the champ after all. Whatever wavelength Suda51 is on, it hits me right in the soul. And I think anyone else that comes even close to that same wavelength is gonna have a fun time with this game too. Whatever Suda and the Grasshopper team decide to do next, I'll be waiting with open arms and an open mind. Thanks, Travis. Until we meet again. Alright, and that is it. End of the 12 days of Jaysmas. Ugh, I honestly don't know how to end this because, man, this was an insane amount of work. I don't know if I'm ever going to do this again. But, hope you guys enjoyed. I hope you're having a great holiday. And I think it's about time I get some sleep. Till next time, everyone.